A mountain that almost every person on this planet knows. A mountain that has been the scene of tragic stories, great successes, surprising changes, and last but not least, great disappointments. Welcome to an episode of Mountains in Focus. Today it's all about the great Mount Everest. Mount Everest is the most famous mountain in the world, because, not surprisingly for most at this point, it is also the highest mountain in the world. With 8,848 meters, it rises far above its neighboring summit, the Lhotse, which is also an 8,000 meter peak. The shape of the mountain is pretty unique. Although it does not have the pointed and sweeping shape as you would expect, Mount Everest visually impresses with endlessly long and extreme steep flanks. The northern flank seems to be impregnable, and also from the west side and the east flank the mountain does not look even remotely more inviting. Its most famous site is the site from the Khumbu Valley, the south side. This is where the most attempts to climb Mount Everest take place, as it runs from the site for a relatively long time in a moderate incline, which is mainly due to the Khumbu Glacier. Mount Everest is also exciting from a geological point of view, as it consists of many complex and different types of rocks, unlike most mountain ranges in the Alps. Above all, however, Everest consists of gneiss and, at higher altitudes, also of granite. But you rarely see too much of the rock anyway, as the Sagarmatha is covered by snow all year round anyway. But Sagarmatha? What's that? Mount Everest is not actually called Mount Everest in Asia. Although the local people know what the term Mount Everest is all about, the Nepalese actually call this mountain Sagarmatha. And it gets even more confusing when you look at the other side of the border mountain to Tibet. Because here he is called Chomolungma. Sagarmatha means forehead of heaven, and Chomolungma, as the Tibetans call him, means mother of the universe. But that should not stop the British from ultimately calling the mountain Mount Everest. But how did this name come about? In order to get to the bottom of this story, we have to take a journey into the history of the first ascent, or more precisely, into the history of the first attempt. Because right away, the highest mountain on this planet did not succeed. Let's take a trip back to 1921. In 1921, India was a British colony, so that British expeditions had a very good starting point for Mount Everest. But at this time, there were no attempts to climb this mountain, so the ideal route was completely unknown. During a circumnavigation of Everest, the British found that the climb over the north side should probably be the most promising, with the challenge that the north side was not British territory. As a result, the British army shot its way through to Tibet. In Tibet itself, the Dalai Lama was personally asked for permission to climb the mountain above their territory, because the Tibetans wanted to prevent exactly that. The Dalai Lama agreed because he was forced to do so, otherwise the entire area of Tibet would have been wiped out. So the British had no scruples when it came to climbing the highest mountain on Earth. The mountain is ultimately called Everest because the surveyor George Everest first discovered and measured it a few decades earlier. The mountain was named after him in his honor. But the first attempt in 1922 brought no success, but some insights. The British expedition had tried to climb Everest a total of 3 times this year. On the first and third attempt, there was a man who was to make it to great fame, especially in the second British expedition in 1924, George Mallory. Because especially the third attempt, which ended just before the ridge, was special. The conditions were good in contrast to the first 2 attempts, and both the porters and the climbers were in good shape. All the climbers were on their way through the northern flank when suddenly a slab of snow went off. Only the team's first rope team and 2 others survived. The rest of the team were dead or not found. That was the end of the expedition. But in 1924, only 2 years later, the British wanted to know again. Again on board, George Mallory. Also Andrew Irvine. He became important because he had already made friends with George Mallory, the highly talented mountaineer, on arrival. But what was about Irvine? He was tech-savvy, and since the ascent only seemed feasible with highly complex oxygen devices at the time, George Mallory wanted a partner in the third attempt on the second British expedition who could repair and operate his oxygen devices. Even if Edward Norton would have been the better mountaineer and partner, whether the choice was the right one or even the better one, that remains to be seen. On the third climb attempt, Mallory and Irvine made their way from Camp 5 to Camp 6 with various porters, but they then sent 2 porters back down to convey an important message to Odell, another climber. Dear Noel, we will probably leave very early tomorrow to have clear weather. It won't be too early to look out for us 8 AM. Either crossing the rock band under the summit pyramid or climbing the ridge. Your G. Mallory. However, this news was the last words one would ever read from George Mallory. Mallory and Irvine disappeared on the summit day, the 8th of June 1924. But Odell has actually observed them in form of black dots. Odell itself and the traces that were found later in the following years did not allow any conclusion to be drawn about a possible first ascent. To this day, no one knows for sure whether the ascent was successful or failed. Although George Mallory was found, Andrew Irvine is still missing today. And it's also clear that Irvine carried a camera whose film could still be developed and evaluated today. A camera film that could include the one photo that would rewrite the entire history of Mount Everest. Because the first ascent of Mount Everest was not successful. Neither unofficially nor officially, which is why it was ultimately still outstanding. This fact was not acceptable to the British, which is why they tried again and again over the years, always unsuccessful. Until the year 1953. This year was to write the story that so many mountaineers in the world know today. Via the Nepalese side of Mount Everest at the Khumbu icefall, this time it should be possible to bring a person onto Mount Everest for the first time. Nothing was left to chance. 2 teams were fielded to improve the odds. The first team only made it to the south summit and had to turn back due to technical problems. Now the moment of truth had come to 2 climbers, for Edmund Hillary and the Sherpa and his now good friend Tenzing Norgay. These 2 finally managed to stand on the summit of the highest mountain on Earth at 11 o'clock in the morning on May the 29th, 1953. For more details about Edmund Hillary, I will make another video about his person. But with the first ascent, Everest did not lose its myths and stories. Many stories should first be written. Thus, a few years later, the question arose whether it was even possible for a person to survive at this altitude without supplemental oxygen. Whether man would not simply fall over and die. No one could say or even calculate that in the 70s. The scientific data and approaches were lacking. On 8th May 1978, 2 mountaineers who are world famous today wanted to pursue exactly this question. Reinhold Messner and Peter Habeler supported a scientific harakiri mission, believing that survival at this altitude might be possible. The 2 climbers risked their life to prove the skeptics of science. On May the 8th, Mount Everest was climbed by the 2 for the first time without artificial oxygen, which in the same time proved that every mountain in the world can be climbed without supplemental oxygen. An important insight for the history of alpinism. But after all the heroic deeds, the events and the new insights that have opened up around Mount Everest, little remains of it today. Mount Everest became an economic factor due to the media attention between 1950 and 1990. Both the Tibet region and Nepal quickly realized the economic role of Mount Everest. Expeditions from foreign and domestic agencies started to offer people the same experience as Hillary, Norgay, Messner and co. have experienced. But criticism was quickly voiced here, as the mountain was always prepared for commercial expeditions. Sherpas carry all the burdens for the climbers, cooks cook their guests' meals, and climbing Sherpas prepare the path so that there are no difficult or dangerous passages at all. Reinhold Messner called this defacement of mountaineering slope alpinism. This trend exploded in the 90s and continues to this day, which is why the cost of an Everest expedition rose immeasurably. You can pay up to $150,000 for a luxury expedition, for example. The mountain has been transformed from a historically important place for discoveries and success to a place of tourism. A type of tourism that over the last few years has increasingly taken over the 8,000-meter peaks, but also mountains in the Alps. To this day, the route over the Khumbu Glacier remains the most popular route. In addition to this, There is still the original ascent route over the Tibetan side, but also other routes, some which have only been climbed few times. So the times of adventure on Mount Everest are not over to this day. Nowhere else in the world do extreme conditions, extreme weather, extreme alpinists and extreme tourism meet as strongly as on the highest mountain in the world, on Mount Everest. There is a lot to tell about Mount Everest. This video could have been at least 40 minutes longer. If you are interested in more about Mount Everest, the political significance, the other routes, or even the historical and religious significance, write it in the comments, then one day there will be definitely a part 2 for Mount Everest. What do you think about Mount Everest? If you could climb it, would you do it despite all the circumstances? What do you think speaks for or against it? Be sure to write this in the comments and please subscribe to the channel. I'm looking forward to read all your opinions about Mount Everest. Until the next time, I wish you, as always, a wonderful time and goodbye.